For decades, the epitome of luxury travel in Europe was the Orient Express, and that is in no small part due to the exquisite cuisine served aboard the train, like these lamb cutlets fried in butter with creamy Duchess potatoes. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we ride the Orient Express, this time on Tasting History. The Orient Express is probably the most famous train in history, though it wasn't actually just one train, but a long-distance railway service that operated numerous trains, all part of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, or International Sleeping Car Company. Running from Paris to Constantinople, later Istanbul, it enjoyed two golden ages. One was from about 1890 until World War I, and the second was between the two world wars. And in both periods, one of the most enticing aspects of the journey was the food being served. Now, starting in the 1890s and going up really all the way till World War II, the menus on the Orient Express and the other trains operated by the company really heavily relied on the recipes of Auguste Escoffier, at least when they were operating the trains near Paris. They included some of his iconic dishes like lobster thermidor, peach melba, jambon agéli or ham aspic, and there were dozens of different potato and lamb cutlet recipes, which is what I'm going to be making today. A plate of his côtelette d'agneau à la minute, and one of his most famous recipes, pommes de terre duchesse, or Duchess potatoes. So, to make these Duchess potatoes, Escoffier says to start off with a croquette mixture, for which you will need 2.5 pounds, or a little more than 1 kilogram of russet potatoes, 7 tablespoons, or 100 grams of butter, 2 teaspoons of salt, plus more for the water that we're going to boil the potatoes in, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, a pinch of nutmeg, and 1 whole egg plus 4 egg yolks at room temperature. So first cut the potatoes into even-sized pieces, and then add them to a pot and cover with water, then add a good amount of salt, about a tablespoon, and bring the water to a boil and let them cook for about 10 minutes until you can pierce them with a knife, though Escoffier says that they should still be quite firm at this point. Today, usually you would just boil them all the way and you're done with the cooking. But Escoffier says to first boil and then dry them out in the oven. So that's what we're going to do. So drain the potatoes and then set them on a lined baking sheet and bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius for another 25 to 30 minutes or until they're very soft. At this point, take them out and pass them through a strainer. Now this can take quite a while, and at certain points you'll be like, nothing is happening, but I promise you, they will go through if you press them through. You can also use just like a ricer. It's going to be a lot faster, but it won't be quite as creamy. So do it the Escoffier way and press them through a strainer. Then set the pot of potatoes over low heat and add in the butter and stir it in, and then add in the 2 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, and that large pinch of nutmeg. Stir these all in and then take it off the heat. Now touch the potatoes, and if they're warm, that's fine, but if they're quite hot, then you need to let them cool down till they are just warm, a little above room temperature, because we're going to add the eggs, and if you add them when they're too hot, they'll scramble and you'll have to start all over. But once the potatoes are just warm, add the egg yolks and the whole egg and mix everything in until it's completely smooth. Now the exciting part of these potatoes is that you can shape them in different ways, and Escoffier gives us a few options in how to shape them. He says mold into the form of a small brioche à tête, bread rolls, or flat cakes, or pipe out with a piping bag and star tube onto a buttered tray. The brioche à tête sounds kind of interesting. It would basically be like a little ball of potato with another little ball on top, but the more traditional and frankly more impressive way to do it is to pipe them. So using a star tip, pipe large mounds of potato onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. This recipe should make between 6 and 10 depending on the size of mounds you want. Also, it does help to let the potatoes come to room temperature before piping because they'll be a little firmer and hold their shape better. Also, once you've piped them, you want them to be even firmer, so put them into the refrigerator for about an hour or so, uncovered, and this will let them be firm enough so that you can brush on some melted butter without ruining all of the wonderful piping that you just did. Once you've brushed on some melted butter, set the tray in the oven, again at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, for about 25 minutes or until they are nicely browned on top. Now these potatoes, while delicious and creamy, do have a reputation for being a little dry, and that's because there isn't as much cream and butter as like a mashed potato because they need to hold their shape. So they are usually served with some sort of rather fatty meat, and for that today I am going to be making côtelette d'agneau à la minute. Cut the cutlets very thin, season them and shallow fry in very hot clarified butter. Arrange them in a circle on a dish, sprinkle with a little lemon juice and the cooking butter after adding a pinch of chopped parsley. Serve immediately. Simple but delicious. So for this, all you'll need is some very small lamb cutlets, and you want to cut them as thin as possible, and you want to get the smallest that you can. You don't want big old lamb chops. As small as you can. Then some clarified butter for frying. You'll also need some juice from fresh lemon and minced parsley for garnish. So season the lamb with a bit of salt and pepper, and then heat the clarified butter in a wide pan, and once it hits about 350 degrees Fahrenheit, carefully set the lamb in about 3 or 4 pieces at a time. Fry them on one side for 2 or 3 minutes, and then flip them over and fry on the other side until the lamb is cooked through and reaches an internal temperature of 145 degrees. As soon as they're cooked, take them out of the butter and set them aside for 2 to 3 minutes just to rest while you transfer your Duchess potatoes onto a plate, and then plate the lamb, sprinkle with a bit of parsley, and drizzle with a bit of the lemon mixed with the butter that the lamb was fried in. That lemon butter is really the best part of this dish. Anyway, I love frying things in clarified butter, but I can't imagine doing it on a train, sloshing about as it's going down the rails. But that is exactly what the cooks on the Orient Express did. They were cooking while the train was in motion. But that's what you had to do if you wanted to provide your passengers with the freshest haute cuisine available on the rails. And that brings up the question, what exactly was it like to ride and dine on the Orient Express? The origin of the Orient Express actually begins in America, where in 1867 a Belgian civil engineer, Georges Nagelmakers, rode in one of the new Pullman train cars, which were the pinnacle of luxury, both in sleeping accommodations and in dining. He was so impressed with these Pullman train cars that he decided to go back to Europe and start a train company with cars that would rival the Pullmans. The issue was that in America, you could get on the train and ride for several days uninterrupted. But in Europe at the time, pretty much all of the train tracks and the trains were run by individual countries. So every time you crossed a border, you would have to get out of the train, go through customs, take all of your luggage off, and then usually get onto a completely different train before going another few hundred miles until you reach the next country. But Georges had a plan, and he had the contacts to make this plan happen, because he was family friends with King Leopold II of Belgium. Now, King Leopold II is in many ways one of the greatest monsters in history. He was responsible for millions, possibly like 10 million deaths in the Belgian Congo, but he was also a train enthusiast, and he was very powerful and well connected, and that is what Georges needed. So with King Leopold II's help, Georges was able to convince all of these different countries to work together to allow this one train to go freely between the countries, basically all the way across Europe. And after some false starts and a few test runs on a smaller scale, the Orient Express made its inaugural trip in October of 1883. Sort of. Because technically the Orient Express couldn't get from Paris to Constantinople at the time because there weren't train tracks for this last part. So you actually had to go from Paris to a town just south of Bucharest, and then you would take a ferry across the Danube to Bulgaria, where you would take an entirely different train to Varna on the Black Sea, and once you arrived at Varna, you had to take a steamship to Constantinople. It wasn't until August of 1888 that the train could go unimpeded all the way from Paris to the Ottoman capital. But even in those early years, the cuisine was supposedly top-notch and was definitely something to be talked about. In fact, one of the first people to ever ride on that inaugural train, who just happened to be a reporter, wrote, "In the front of the train, the dining car, with its curtains coquettishly raised, casts an extraordinary luster on the whole scene. Large gas lights illuminate a veritable banquet hall. The tables, side by side, those with 4 seats on the right, those with 2 seats on the left, in 7 rows, are set up in a most sumptuous manner. The bright white tablecloths and napkins are artistically folded by the restaurant sommelier. The crystal clear sparkle of the glassware, filled with rubies of red wine and topaz of white. The pure crystal water decanters and the silver caps of the champagne bottles dazzle the crowd both inside and outside, a contrast to the sorrow of parting seen on their faces." And the dining car wasn't just the restaurant, but it also had a drawing room for the ladies with wonderful plush velvet chairs, and then a library/smoking room for the men that had leather armchairs and bookcases filled with books, maps, and newspapers, which were swapped in and out at each country they passed through. The dining room itself, lit by gaslight chandeliers, was furnished with wall tapestries, silk drapes, and leather and velvet chairs. And there were tables of 4 and of 2 and could seat 42 passengers in all. The tables were set with fresh flowers, polished silverware, porcelain china, and baccarat crystal glasses, just like you would find in any of the fine Parisian or London hotel restaurants of the day. And because of the international nature of the train, the staff in the early years were expected to speak multiple languages. Usually it was French, German, and English, or Italian, and sometimes other languages like Turkish. In fact, in 1894, it was said that collectively the entire staff on the train could speak 50 different languages and dialects. Now, the kitchen staff on the train usually were all French, and they worked in some of the best French hotel restaurants that Paris had to offer before getting courted and working on the train. And they all worked under the chef de cuisine. And in October of 1883, someone wrote of the genius of how this chef put together the menu. See, as you crossed from country to country, from France and Austria and Bulgaria and all these other countries, the menu would change to reflect the country that you were in. So yes, you would still have some French food, obviously, but you would also have some cuisine from the location that you're at. This genius of a man has prepared us dishes of exquisite flavor, with menus varied by the countries which we pass through. Danube sterlet, fresh Romanian caviar, and Turkish pilaf, while the sommelier follows suit, pouring us the most illustrious vintages of the Moselle, the Rhine, of Hungary and Romania. And not only was the food excellent, but according to one American traveler, it was well priced as well. Cy Warman said the food was equal to the best in any country, and the rates are reasonable. You have 3 good meals for $2.55, which in America, in the average dining car, would cost $3. Well, by golly, that is a deal. He was also really impressed with the sleeping arrangements on the train, because most trains in the US at that time were kind of done in a dormitory style, so you were sleeping right next to someone with just a little curtain between you, unless you were paying for like a suite on one of the Pullman trains. But on the Orient Express, a compartment holds 2 or 4 people, and often, with the judicious expenditure of a few francs, the voyager can secure a small compartment all to himself, and he is quite as secluded and comfortable as he would be in the stateroom of a Pullman or Wagner. Now, while we are making an Orient Express dinner, the day, of course, would have started out with an Orient Express breakfast, and this was usually different kinds of eggs and an assortment of meats and fruit and different pastries. But according to Joseph Riley, an Englishman who was traveling in 1889, he said most of the passengers just didn't really eat anything, but just drank a cup of tea or coffee or a glass of wine. And I guess they were on vacation, so why shouldn't they have wine for breakfast? And maybe they were just saving room for lunch, because lunch could be 7 to 10 courses, and it was supposedly so excellent that if you were royalty, you would get on to eat even if you didn't have anywhere to go. At Sofia, Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria got into the train. It appeared that Prince Ferdinand's pastime was to join the train in this way, have his déjeuner on board, get out at the frontier, and return to his capital by the next train. It seems a curious mode of enjoyment, but probably Bulgaria was less lively than it has become since. Anyhow, we presently saw some apricot omelets walking about and asked for some, but were told that this was a déjeuner commandé, and we could not share it, to which deprivation we resigned ourselves. Dinner was similarly delicious, but far more fancy, because on the train, dinner was a black tie affair. Men would dress in their best, and women would put on their best gowns and jewels, and it was very, very formal. Though there was one time on the train that you should eat dinner before you actually get on the train, and that is when you are leaving Istanbul to head back to Paris, because there was no diner car when it left Istanbul. The diner car didn't actually meet up with it until it got to Bulgaria. So just in time for breakfast, so make sure to eat before you get on board. Now, the first golden age of the Orient Express came to a rather abrupt halt at the outbreak of World War I. Though one of the dining cars used by the Wagonlit company actually played a pivotal role when, on November 11, 1918, German officers signed their surrender in a dining car known as the Compiègne Wagon. Unfortunately, the Germans used that same dining car in a bit of spite in 1940 when they demanded the surrender of the French to the German army during World War II. And it was never used again because Hitler had it blown up when he realized he was going to lose the war, just so the Allies couldn't get their hands on it again. Now, between these two world wars, well, that is the second and most glorious golden age of the Orient Express. And in the 1920s, just a couple years after it came back into service, it was redesigned with steel carriages, which offered a more comfortable ride. And they'd also been designed with the modern Art Deco interiors that would come to be so iconic. And this was the train that featured in Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Now, when she published that book, there had never been a Murder on the Orient Express. But I guess she jinxed it, because only about a year after she published it, in 1935, somebody was murdered. It was a wealthy Romanian fashion designer. She was robbed and pushed out the window and found on the side of the tracks a little while later. Now, 2 years after she published her novel, another novelist, Beverly Nichols, wrote of actual experience on the train. And while it didn't include any murder, it did include lunch. A bell tinkles in the corridor of the Orient Express. Lunch! We get up with hunger gnawing at our inside, filled with delight at the prospect of eating crisp rolls and potato mayonnaise, and veal and petit pois, and slabs of fromage de pays, washed down by white wine drunk from a tumbler, which is the only way to drink white wine. And not only does the prospect of the food allure us, but the fact that we shall be devouring it in a fantastic chariot of steel and glass, hurling through a foreign country. There must be something seriously wrong with the man who does not enjoy lunching in the train. Now, the second golden age of the train ended at the outbreak of World War II, and while it did return to service after the war, its golden age never really returned. Partly it was because of the Iron Curtain. Europe was now divided in two, and the train traveling through so many Soviet countries became a logistical nightmare when it came to travel visas. Also, there was the proliferation of air travel. So why take several days to go across Europe when you could take several hours instead? This is not to say that the luxury of the Orient Express ended. Quite the opposite. In fact, it just got more and more luxurious because the train itself ended up becoming the destination. You didn't take it from Paris to Istanbul because you needed to get from Paris to Istanbul. You took it because you wanted to ride on the Orient Express. It's kind of like the difference between taking an ocean liner to get from England to New York rather than taking a cruise where you're not really going anywhere, you just want to be on a cruise ship. But the train continued to be in service between Paris and Istanbul until 1977 and still ran other routes until 2009 when it ceased operation. Though in recent years, a completely restored version of the Orient Express, which is supposed to be really luxurious, has been out on the tracks again, and you can actually ride the Orient Express. And supposedly, they even try to recreate some of the earlier dishes from the golden age of the Orient Express. Though I don't know if they make these exact Auguste Escoffier recipes that I am about to eat right now. And here we are. Lamb cutlets fried in butter with creamy Duchess potatoes. So the potatoes, you can actually just pick them up, but that's not classy, so you should cut into them. They're really, they look firmer than like a mashed potato. Let's give it a try. It's very hot. I never test the temperature of my food before I eat it. It's a really bad habit. And it often burns my mouth. I have no patience, I guess. Quite warm. But once I got past the burning, the texture is actually really nice. They are drier than like a mashed potato, but they're also creamier at the same time. Like the texture is so soft and smooth because we pressed it through the sieve. When it comes to the flavor, they're really rich. Like you can really taste all of that butter in there. They're often made with cream today. It's like part cream, part butter. So that might change the texture. But these, with all the butter and the egg, they're just so rich. but it does need some of that fat from the lamb, which I'm going to try right now, especially when you drizzle on that lemon butter. Oh, so good. Here we go. That lemon butter is heavenly. They're perfectly cooked. Like I said, you want to get them nice and thin because if they're too thick, they'll start to burn on the outside before it's totally cooked all the way through. And you don't really want any char or anything like that. You want it tender all the way through. They're so flavorful. I could eat like a dozen of these because they're so small. But on the train, this would have been one of like 7 or 8 courses. So you would just want to take a couple bites and then move on to the next dish. I didn't make 7 or 8 courses, so I'll be eating all of these. They're absolutely wonderful if you like lamb, which I do. Fantastic. Most people around my age know one thing about the Oregon Trail, and that's that you're likely to die of dysentery. But it turns out there was so much more to this 2,000+ mile trek west, including the fact that it took 4 to 6 months, and that you'd be having about 500 campfire meals, many of which would have been Johnny cakes and bacon. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we try not to die of dysentery. This time on Tasting History. So for those who don't know, the Oregon Trail was actually a collection of wagon trails that went from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon. And from 1846 to 1869, about 400,000 settlers, farmers, miners, ranchers, and their families used it to cross 2,200 miles of prairie, desert, and mountain terrain. Now, it wasn't exactly a single trail, and there were people who would split off to go settle in California or Utah, but in general, for about half of the year, there were wagon trains heading west along a general trail. And the people in those wagons were known as emigrants, and every morning around 4 a.m., they would wake up, start making fires so they could prepare their breakfast. And one of the most common breakfasts was bacon, hoe cakes, or Johnny cakes, which are a corn cake, and coffee. Now, these Johnny cakes were very popular at the time. They had been popular since the 18th century, and they went under a host of names, including hoe cakes, but also Indian meal cakes or Indian corn cakes, which is what the Farmers and Emigrants Complete Guide from 1856 calls it. Written by Josiah T. Marshall, it says, take 1 quart of sifted Indian meal, 2 tablespoonfuls of molasses, 2 teaspoonfuls of salt, a bit of shortening, lard or butter, half as big as a hen's egg, stir these together, make it pretty moist with scalding water, put it into a well-greased pan, smooth the surface, and bake it brown on both sides before a quick fire. Now, he does have instructions to make a fancier version that has milk and cinnamon and ginger, but I'm going to make this basic version because I feel like this is what most people would have been eating on most mornings on the Oregon Trail. And frankly, if you need the fancy version, then the Oregon Trail is probably not for you. I'm sure those people on the Oregon Trail would have really appreciated some free dessert. Alas, at least in the mornings, all they had was Johnny cakes and bacon. They had other things, but to make Johnny cakes and bacon, what you'll need is 2 cups or 300 grams of fine cornmeal, 1 tablespoon of molasses, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons or 30 grams of unsalted butter, and some boiling water. And then you'll also need some grease to grease the pan. And the best way to get grease, and probably how they would have done it, is to fry the bacon in that pan. It also should give the Johnny cakes some nice bacony flavor. So first fry up your bacon however you like it, then set it aside but keep the grease in the pan. Then add the molasses, salt, and the butter into the cornmeal, and then work it all in by hand. Then pour some boiling water in and using a spoon, start mixing it together. Now, the amount of water that you add is really up to you. For a firmer cake, you're gonna add about 3/4 of a cup of water, but you can add a little bit more for a looser cake. He's not super specific in how wet this mixture should be, but he does say that it should be smoothed on the top. So if it's too loose, you won't be able to smooth it. It'll just automatically do it. So I'm guessing it's a little firmer. So form up some round cakes by hand and then heat the grease up and carefully set the cake in. Now, unlike pancakes, which will have little bubbles form on the top that let you know when it's time to flip it, these don't have that, so you kind of just gotta eyeball it. For me, it took about 3 minutes on one side and then 2 minutes on the other side. So obviously, if we're able to make these, we know that the emigrants would have been bringing cornmeal, molasses, bacon, and salt. When it comes to the butter, they would have often brought a milk cow with them, and in the morning they would milk it, put it into a pail, and attach it to the bottom of the wagon, and throughout the day the jostling of the wagon would actually churn it into butter that they would have that night, some nice fresh butter. But it wasn't all Johnny cakes and bacon for every meal every day. So what else did those pioneers pack up to take with them before shouting, "Wagons! Ho!" So it's the 1850s, and you have just had it with the East Coast. So you're moving west using that newfangled Oregon Trail. So you make your way to Independence, Missouri, where you pack up your covered wagon. Now, these were not the really big covered wagons that were rambling down the streets of America at the time. No, these were smaller covered wagons known as prairie schooners. And you need to gather up 4 to 6 months worth of provisions and pack it all into this rather small wagon. Luckily, people who have gone before you have written down general guidelines of what you might need. And when it comes to food, which is what I'm concerned with, for 3 people, they say you should bring about 5 barrels or 1,080 pounds of flour, 600 pounds of bacon, 100 pounds of coffee, 5 pounds of tea, 150 pounds sugar, 75 of rice, 50 of dried fruit, 50 of salt, pepper, and other seasonings, and 10 pounds of saleratus, or baking soda. Other guides from the period say to bring about 200 pounds of lard, plenty of dried beans, dried fruit, and cornmeal, and of course about 120 pounds of hardtack. Many people also brought that milk cow as well as chickens for eggs. Now all this food was either packed in barrels or more often in provision boxes, which could be stacked and so they wouldn't jostle around too much, and they could be used for chairs and tables, which was really convenient when you had no chairs and tables. Now since there was no refrigeration, you might think that things like bacon and lard would go bad really quickly. But people would take that and pack it inside of the barrel that had the flour or the cornmeal to keep it away from any sun, and so it would stay for pretty much the entire journey. Now in addition to food, you needed to bring some cooking utensils. This typically meant a frying pan, a Dutch oven, a kettle or coffee pot, tin plates and cups, and maybe a reflector oven, which would bounce the heat off of an open fire to bake cakes and pies. But in general, when it comes to packing, less is more. There was actually one pioneer from the time who had made the trek before, and he is scoffing at those he sees overpacking. They laid in an oversupply of bacon, flour, and beans, and in addition thereto, every conceivable gimcrack and useless article that the wildest fancy could devise, or human ingenuity could invent. Pins and needles, brooms and brushes, ox shoes and horseshoes, lasts and leather, glass beads and hawk's bells, jumping jacks and jew harps, rings and bracelets, pocket mirrors and pocket books, calico vests and boiled shirts. And much of this stuff would end up abandoned on the side of the trail within the first few weeks of travel. Now, the food that you're packing is not, of course, the only food that you're going to have on the journey. People were walking most of the 15 to 20 miles that they traveled each day because being in the wagon was really uncomfortable. It was really bumpy. They didn't have any shocks or anything, so most people were walking, so they were using up a lot of calories. So it was necessary to find extra victuals along the way. And in the early years, there were no shops or trading posts along the trail. But by the 1850s, forts like Fort Kearny and Fort Laramie would have stores where you could top off your provisions or replace anything that might have broken, provided that they had it, and they very often didn't. They were usually just as out of things as you were. But if they did have it, you were probably going to be paying like 5 times as much as you would back in Missouri, because what else are you going to do? A much less expensive way to get food, if a little more difficult, was to go back to your roots and hunting and gathering. And sometimes that would mean actual roots, things like wild onions and garlic, and something called camas root. The pioneer Phoebe Judson, writing about the American Indians she met, said the camas root, a very nutritious pear-shaped bulb about half the size of an onion, was their chief dependence. It was to them what bread is to us, the staff of life. After steaming the bulbs in a hole in the ground with hot rocks covered with ferns, they were dried. This, with game, was their usual diet. You could also go fishing, provided you knew how and were near a river, and if you didn't know how, you could also do like Phoebe Judson and just trade for some fish. When we reached Salmon Falls on Snake River, the Indians brought some red-meated salmon to the camp. Mr. Judson traded some sugar for a fine, large one, and as it was too late to cook it that night, he dressed it and put it into the water keg under our wagon. We were really so delighted with the prospect of salmon for breakfast that we could not sleep. But the next morning, when they woke up, our beautiful fish was missing. And so was Mr. Bryant's dog. As we never saw him again, he evidently indulged in too much salmon for breakfast and paid the penalty with his life. As for game meat, on the prairie at least, you had prairie dogs, which were supposedly very, very fatty, but also ducks and rabbits and geese and sage hens. They'd use these hens to make a soup with dumpling that most people seemed to really enjoy, but one woman did not. I think a skunk preferable. Their meat tastes of this abominable mountain sage. Now these were of course small little critters, good for maybe one meal, but if you wanted to save up some meat, they had big game like antelope and of course buffalo. But the thing is, even just a couple buffalo or bison is going to be so much meat that you're not going to be able to eat that all in one sitting, even if you've got several hundred people in the wagon train, so they would have to store it, and usually that meant making it into jerky. They would cut it into strips and then hang it on a rope around the edge of the wagon, and so as they went down the prairie, it would dry in the wind, and one person said it made all of the wagons look like they were decorated with a coarse red fringe. Now, most people really enjoyed the meat of the buffalo, but there is one story about a man who got an old bull, and I guess the meat was not very good. It tasted like the chef d'oeuvre of the devil's kitchen, the most offensive meat I ever tasted, and so that I found it impossible to eat it. But typically, the meat was very much loved. Now, the emigrants on the Oregon Trail rarely had time to stop to get any more buffalo than they could eat or carry. But it was around this time that other people with more sinister intentions were decimating the buffalo population in an effort to destroy the food source of the Plains Indians. In 1864, near the end of the Oregon Trail era, one emigrant wrote that some of our men went today hunting for buffalo and antelope, but saw none. While the bleached bones of the buffalo are strewn all along the road, not an animal was seen. The needless and wanton slaughter of these once numerous animals has almost caused them to be extinct. The thing is, it wasn't just the meat of the buffalo that both the Plains Indians and the pioneers relied on. It was their poop. See, if you've ever seen the Great Plains, you'll notice there aren't a lot of trees, not a lot of firewood going on. And so they would gather the chips or the poop of the buffalo to start fires. And I guess as long as it's dry, it burns really well and doesn't smell that much. Many of the ladies can be seen roaming over the prairie with sacks in hand, searching for a few buffalo chips to cook their evening meal. Some of the ladies are seen wearing gloves, but most of them have discarded their gloves and are gathering the buffalo chips with their bare hand. And with your dried buffalo poop in hand, it was time to actually get to cooking. And this is where the pioneers they really impressed me, because especially in the first part of their journey, where they still had a lot of the ingredients that they were bringing, they were making up some really fancy, complicated foods, if not, maybe not fancy, but complicated foods. They would always have fresh bread that could be risen with either Salertus, which is baking soda, or the newfangled Preston's yeast powder, no excuse for bad bread. And should they run out of these, they would make salt rising bread, which is just ingenious. So you know how like a sourdough starter relies on yeast to build up, to rise the bread? Well, salt rising bread relies on bacteria. Usually the ingredients were just water, salt, flour, and then some cornmeal or dried potato. And it needed to be kept warm all day. So they would make it up and then put that that starter in the front of the wagon where it was warm and the sun was hitting it, and it would start to rise. And then that night they could use it to make fresh bread. Absolutely brilliant. But even more impressive than the bread was the fact that they were making pies and cakes out there. There are letters that talk about fresh-made antelope pot pie and pound cake and peach pie and apple pie, though often the apple pie was made with dried apples, which I guess was not always the best thing, as there was a slogan during the time that said, "Spit in my ears and tell me lies, but give me no dried apple pies." Now, the meal that they seemed to go hog wild for was the 4th of July dinner. Part of it was that it was a big celebration because it's 4th of July, but also it was around the halfway point for many of the emigrants. And so they would kind of splurge and use up a lot of the good things that they still had left. In 1849, William Swain wrote about the midday meal on the 4th of July. Dinner consisted of ham, beans, boiled and baked, biscuits, John cake, apple pie, sweet cake, rice pudding, pickles, vinegar, pepper sauce and mustard, coffee, sugar, and milk. All enjoyed it well. The boys had raked and scraped together all the brandy they could, and they toasted, hurrayed, and drank till reason was out and brandy was in. I stayed till the 5 regular toasts were drunk, and then, being disgusted with their conduct, I went to our tent, took my pen, and occupied the remainder of the day in writing to my wife. Or at least that's what he told her he did, I'm sure. Now, since this was a time when provisions started to run low, at least the more luxurious provisions, there were, of course, people who had already gone through them. George Keller had a 4th of July dinner on musty hard bread and beef bones in a state of incipient putrefaction. And Amos Steck said that it was just like any other day for him, and he had spent it driving a slow ox team in a sandy road, his eyes filled and his throat choked with it, with no other refreshment than hard bread for dinner, and poor bread at that. He will feel little patriotic ardor stimulating him even on this great day. Granted, these were the wagon trains that were made up of pretty much just men, because it was the women who did most of the real cooking. As James Hutchings lamented, "I wish I had taken lessons in the art of every man his own washerwoman, cook, and general housewife." But whether or not you could cook didn't really matter when you started to run out of ingredients, which would happen the further down the road you got. All of the little delicacies we brought with us from home were gone, and we had nothing left but flour, bacon, beans, sugar, and tea. And like the children of Israel, my soul loathed this food, and I longed for something fresh. The farther we traveled, the more meager became our fare. This was the time when the pioneers came to rely on things like buffalo jerky, hardtack, and portable soup. This was something where you would boil down the meat and bones of an animal so much that it became just this gelatinous kind of layer on the bottom of a pot. And then you would cut that up and let it dry, and you could take that then and later put it into some water and make a soup. It was like a bouillon cube. Then there was something called meat biscuit. 1 pound of it contained the nutriment of 5 pounds of the best fresh beef. It will keep in perfect preservation for any length of time. In tight tin canister or casks, the traveler across the plain can always have a fresh supply of food easily and quickly prepared. Now, the problem with the dwindling food supply was not just that it left everyone rather hangry, but also depressed. Because when you're traveling every single day, all day, it's kind of boring and monotonous, and the only thing people were looking forward to was their next meal. Eating was the best part of the day, even in the harshest conditions. Ate breakfast this morning in a snowstorm, and although the prospect did look rather gloomy, still we kept in good cheer, and our victuals, crusted not with sugar but snow, certainly disappeared in a manner that plain showed that we had not lost our appetites, even if we were experiencing all the delights of a snowstorm in the open prairie. It was also around this time that they started to run out of lemon extract. See, they would often add lemon extract and maybe a little sugar to their water to make a sort of lemonade, because the water did not taste good. It was hard to find any kind of thing resembling clean water at all, but especially out in the prairie, everything was covered in dust. All of their stuff, themselves, their food, and their water just caked in dust. And so they would often add aluminum ammonia sulfate to the water, which would kind of help purify it, but it made it taste absolutely awful. When they didn't have that, they would just put cornmeal into the water and wait like 20 or 30 minutes. And as the cornmeal dropped to the bottom, it would take some of the dirt with them, leaving a little clean-ish water on the top, but still didn't taste great. And with people running out of their luxury items, their food, and sometimes clean water, the Oregon Trail was about to do them real dirty when they came upon Fort Laramie, also dubbed Camp Sacrifice. This was the last major stop before you headed over the Rocky Mountains. And as difficult on the oxen as it's been to drag your butt across the Great Plains, it's going to be even harder for them to drag it up the Rocky Mountains. So you had to get rid of everything that was extra. And I don't mean just like things like books and fine china and things that are kind of not necessary, though they did get rid of those. But in some cases, even things that were necessary if it was deemed too heavy. There was one wagon train who just needed to lighten the load, and so they discarded a ton of bacon, several barrels of bread, 6 dozen steel shovels, axes, hoes, etc., etc., amounting in value to nearly $1,500. Also, I love how they used to write etc., which was the ampersand C, because the et in etc. literally means and. I just think that's cool. I don't think anybody ever writes that anymore. Now it's just etc. Anyway, one thing that someone had to discard kind of brings a tear to the eye. A man named Smith had a wooden rolling pin that it was decided was useless and must be abandoned. I shall never forget how that big man stood there with tears streaming down his face as he said, "Do I have to throw it away? It was my mother's. I remember she always used it to roll out her biscuits, and they were awful good biscuits." It's really amazing what these people went through and gave up to start this new life. And I don't just mean giving up their mother's rolling pin, but giving up everything that they had left behind. Many of these people would never again see the family and friends that they had known back east. And I don't think I could have done it. I really don't think I could have lasted very long doing 6 months of hard living, hard traveling, and hard eating. Maybe a week. I think I could have lasted a week. Maybe 2 if these Johnny cakes taste as good as they smell. And here we are, a pioneer breakfast of Johnny cakes and bacon from the Oregon Trail. So sometimes people would have put like honey or syrup or more molasses on these, but I'm going to just try them, still hot, as is. Here we go. So the texture is a little, it's not dry, it's almost like gritty, but not unpleasantly so, but it's kind of, it's a little grittier than I might like, but the flavor is really, really good. I kind of expected them to be bland, but they're not. It's, you know, it's kind of like cornbread, which cornmeal, it's like cornbread and molasses mixed together, so you kind of get that sweetness. But then the fact that it's like fried basically in bacon grease, that's really nice. And you get a really, really nice bacony flavor to it. It kind of reminds me of like a 19th century version of a McDonald's McGriddle. I actually think that that these are gonna grow on me. This is something I could eat 1 or 2 of them. They're a little, I think it's just that they're a little more dense than like a fluffy pancake because there is nothing in there to raise it. No raising agent, so it's just kind of heavy. But it comes with bacon. The bacon, of course, is it's just bacon, but it's really fatty bacon because that's what they would have had, so I got the fattiest that I could find. And it's really, really good. Also, how cool is this fork? I got it from Townsend's. They have a bunch of really just cool stuff from this period, mostly earlier, 18th century, but I thought it fit. Plus, it's just cool looking. So I think these are something that you should try. It's totally worth it. Maybe swap out some of the water for milk or just kind of play with it. You can add some spice, make the fancier version. But even as is, especially if you're going across the prairie and you're really hungry, it's a great meal. So give these a try, don't die of dysentery, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. This video is brought to you by Squarespace. Last year, I recreated several dishes from the last dinners aboard the Titanic, but I completely neglected the most important meal of the day, breakfast. So today, I am recreating a first-class breakfast aboard the Titanic. So my tastorians, I ask you,
are you ready to go back to Titanic?
This time on Tasting History. First-class meals aboard the Titanic were opulent and plentiful. Dinner could be up to 11 courses if you considered the post-dessert fruit and cheese a course, which I do, of course. And while breakfast wasn't as regimented or as robust as dinner, there was still a lot of food on offer. The menu presented had dozens of options and you could order whatever you liked. Personally, I've decided on a first-class breakfast of baked apples, smoked salmon, shirred eggs, buckwheat cakes with black currant conserve and Oxford marmalade, and a bit of watercress at the end to aid in digestion. Now, there are no actual recipes from Titanic, but we do know that, especially for the first class, much of the food was based on the recipes of Auguste Escoffier. One of his greatest cookbooks, Le Guide Culinaire, has recipes for most of the dinner and lunch menu, but fewer recipes for breakfast. But he does have one for the baked apples, as well as one that describes how to present the smoked salmon. For that, he says to cut in very thin slices, trim, roll into cornets, and arrange on a dish with a little parsley. Super easy, and his baked apples are pretty simple as well. He just says to core them, leaving a bit of core at the very bottom, and then cut a thin line through the skin around the middle of the apples, then set them in a tray, and fill the center of each with a mixture of butter and castor sugar. Add a little water to the tray, and cook the apples gently in the oven. So take 4 tablespoons of softened butter and beat in a half cup of superfine sugar for the filling. Another contemporary recipe from Fanny Farmer actually says that that is all that you need in the fall. But towards spring, they become somewhat tasteless, and spice is an improvement. So she suggests adding a half teaspoon of cinnamon as well, and as Titanic sailed in the spring, that is what I did. Then fill the apples with the filling, then pour some boiling water into the dish, just enough to cover the bottom, and set the apples in the oven at 375 Fahrenheit or 190 Celsius for about an hour or until they're nice and soft but not mushy. Now, Escoffier does not have recipes for either the buckwheat cakes or the shirred eggs, but luckily Fanny Farmer, whose cookbook was selling off the charts when the Titanic sailed, does have recipes for those, so that's who I'm going to look to for those recipes. Now, Fanny Farmer's buckwheat cakes are very similar to modern pancakes, but yeasted, so instead of using baking powder to give them a rise, they use yeast. So to make these, you'll need 2 cups or 475 milliliters of milk and then scald it. Then pour it over 1/3 cup of breadcrumbs and let it soak for 30 minutes. Then once the mixture has had time to cool, add in a half teaspoon of salt and 2 teaspoons of dried yeast and stir until dissolved. Then add in the buckwheat flour. Now, Fanny is not specific on exactly how much buckwheat to add. She just says, add buckwheat to make a batter thin enough to pour. For me, that was about a cup, then cover the batter, let it rise overnight, then she says, in the morning, stir well, add molasses, and cook as griddle cakes. So stir in 1 tablespoon of molasses, then pour a bit of the batter onto a hot griddle over medium heat, and let them cook for about a minute to a minute and a half before flipping them over and letting them cook for another minute. And you can make them any size that you want, but the larger they are, the harder they are to flip. Now, the last thing we have to make is the shirred eggs, but before we do so, I wanted to point out a couple of interesting little things that are on this menu for breakfast from the Titanic. First, there's a typo. The word marmalade is spelled marmalade, and the mistake was not replicated on the second-class menu, so I like to imagine that the typo was actually very much on purpose, a passive-aggressive action taken by the steward who had to spend the days working with the first class, who I assume are rather insufferable on the Titanic, and yeah. I have no evidence to back that up, but that's what I like to imagine. Second interesting thing is the date, April 11th, 1912. And that's different from most of the menus that we have, which are from April 14th, the day that the Titanic hit an iceberg. And once you hit the like button and subscribe to Tasting History, I'm going to let you know why that is. Numerous menus survive from the Titanic, and most of them are from the day of the sinking because people were still carrying them in their jacket pockets when they were taken out of the ocean and saved by the Carpathia. So for third class, we have the entire day because the entire day's meals were laid out on one menu. But for first and second class, different menus were printed for different meals, so most of what we have are from dinner that night, and then we have a few from luncheon that day. But they'd likely left their breakfast menus in their staterooms, which are now at the bottom of the Atlantic. So both the first and second class breakfast menus that survived are actually from Thursday, April 11th, because that was the day at 11:30 a.m. that Titanic arrived at Queenstown, Ireland, its last stop before heading to New York. There, RMS Titanic, being a Royal Mail ship, took on a lot of mail destined for America. But there were also a few pieces of mail that got off. These were the last postcards and letters that passengers aboard Titanic ever sent to their loved ones, and a few of them included little souvenirs, some of which were the menus from breakfast that they had had that morning. And what's cool is that besides the menus, this is really the only time that we get a glimpse into the passenger experience aboard the Titanic without the taint of the events that would happen a few days later. Like one from 20-year-old Alfred Nourney, who had actually purchased a second-class ticket, but he complained about his cabin, and as people complaining often get, he got upgraded up to first class. So he was able to send a giddy postcard to his mother from Queenstown. "Dear Mother, I am so happy being first class. I already know some nice people. A Diamond King, Mr. Astor, one of the wealthiest Americans, is on board. 1,000 kisses, Alfred." A less giddy letter was sent to a friend by eminent American painter, writer, and curmudgeon Francis Millet. "Queer lot of people on this ship. There are a number of obnoxious, ostentatious American women. The scourge of any place they infest, and worse on shipboard than anywhere. Many of them carry tiny dogs and lead husbands around like pet lambs." And he wasn't wrong. There were a number of first-class ladies who did bring their little dogs with them. There were actually 12 dogs on board, most of whom spent their days in the kennel on F deck, though 4 of the smaller dogs would stay in the cabins with their owners. Now 3 of these dogs being kept in the cabins were the only dogs to survive the sinking, and even then, in one case of the Pomeranian Lady, she was only able to get onto a lifeboat because her owner wrapped her up like a baby, and the crew member thought it was a little baby she was carrying. I have a child! And supposedly, when saved by the Carpathia, those crew members didn't want at least one of the dogs to come aboard, but luckily, all 3 dogs did get off the lifeboats and onto the Carpathia and survived. But the 4th dog, Frou-Frou, who did stay in a cabin, he did not survive because his owner, Helen Bishop, later wrote, "The loss of my little dog hurt me very much. I will not forget how he dragged on my clothes. He so wanted to accompany me." But there would be little sympathy for a woman carrying a dog in her arms when there were lives of women and children to be saved. There's a sad story, the veracity of which is somewhat suspect, of Anne Elizabeth Isham. Now, she had gotten into a lifeboat, and the lifeboat was ready to go down when she got out to go to the kennel to save what in most stories is a Great Dane. And she never made it back to the lifeboats. And whether or not it's true, again, suspect, but it is true that she is one of only 5 female first-class passengers to have died on the Titanic. Now, if one did decide to bring a dog on board, they had to pay. You basically had to buy a ticket at a lower price for your animal. There was even a 25-penny fee paid for a canary that sailed from Southampton to Cherbourg and got off at Cherbourg, surviving the Titanic. Now, whether or not you had a dog or a canary with you, if you were an early riser, you could have tea and scones brought to your stateroom, but for most, mealtime was served from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., but where you enjoyed your breakfast was very much up to you. In the first-class dining room, over 550 passengers can dine at the same time, and a feature of the room is the arrangement of the recessed bays, where family and other parties can dine together in semi-privacy. And hopefully you had thought ahead and decided where you wanted to sit before you boarded. But passengers who have not previously arranged for seats at table to be reserved should apply for same to the second steward. Children are not entitled to seats in the saloon unless full fare is paid. Now, if you wanted something a little more elite, you could take your breakfast in the a la carte restaurant on B deck. Now, meals at the a la carte restaurant were not included in the price of your ticket, breakfast costing an additional 3 shillings. But the food and experience were supposed to be exquisite, and more importantly, exclusive, because you did have to have reservations made ahead of time. As Lady Duff Gordon said, "Fancy strawberries in April, and in mid-ocean. The whole thing is positively uncanny. Why, you would think you were at the Ritz." And many passengers did refer to the a la carte restaurant as the Ritz. But if the Ritz was still a little too public for you, or if you'd simply had too much brandy in the smoking room the night before and just couldn't be bothered to drag yourself down to the dining saloon, you could take a full breakfast in your room. Or if you had one of the 2 deluxe parlor suites on B deck, like Rose from Titanic, you could dine on your own private promenade deck. One thing that made this possible aboard Titanic was the advent of these silver plate food warmers, along with hot water sleeves that would kind of go around the food trays to keep things warm, similar to those insulated bags your pizza comes in when you order delivery. And if you were dining in your room, you'd likely be ordering from the menu that we are using today. And that menu, along with all of the menus, would have been put together by the chief first-class steward, Andrew Latimer, along with the chefs on board. Now, we obviously know about the dishes that we are making today, but there are a few other things on the menu that I kind of want to point out. First, Quaker Oats and puffed rice, both of which were made by the Quaker Oats Company, an executive of which, Walter Donald Douglas, was traveling aboard Titanic. I can only assume that when he saw his company's product on the menu, he would feel obliged to order it as long as he had room after eating all of the meat that was provided on this menu. Grilled mutton, kidneys and bacon, grilled ham, sausage, sirloin steak, mutton chops, and of course, lamb collops. Slices of meat, in this case lamb, that was served with a sort of brown gravy and mushrooms very often, but there are different ways to make collops. Also, in England, the Monday before Lent is known as Collop Monday, and that's a day that everybody would eat collops, though I prefer the following day, which is Pancake Day. Thank you very much. Other breakfast options were eggs made most any way, as well as potatoes, mashed, sautéed, or jacket, that is, baked potatoes. And for bread, which there was plenty of, you could have scones, cornbread, or Vienna or graham rolls. And Vienna rolls were only called that in England. Most other places called them Kaisersemmel or Kaiser rolls, and that's because the design on them looked like the Kaiser's crown. They can be made in all sorts of ways, but the shape is really the important thing, and today usually they're quite large and we eat them for sandwiches or hamburgers, but most of the older recipes that I was looking at call for rather small, tight buns like meant for breakfast. There you go. Now, graham rolls were also on the smaller side and were made of graham flour, which today is mostly just used for graham crackers. And all of these would have been baked daily aboard Titanic by the chief baker, Charles Joffin, and his team of bakers. And I did a whole video on him and how he survived by getting drunk and then riding the stern down, again alongside Rose from the movie. Now, to accompany the bread, you had the options of black currant conserve, basically jam, Oxford marmalade, sometimes written as marmalade, at least on the menu, and that was on the ship. It was Frank Cooper's Oxford marmalade, and you can actually still buy that today. I did. What I did not buy was the Narbonne honey. The real Narbonne honey, which is made in a specific region in southern France. It's a white honey, and it's supposed to be wonderful, but it's really, really expensive. I found it for like $70 for a little jar like that, so one day I'll get it, but not today. And while $70 for a jar of honey is a little out of my budget range right now, it'd be nothing if you were, say, worth $1 billion, like the only Spanish couple in first class, Victor Peñasco and Maria Josefa Peñasco, Pepita to her family. And while their story really has nothing to do with breakfast, other than the fact that they would have eaten it while aboard the ship, I really wanted to tell their story because I think it's fascinating and it's definitely one of the lesser known stories from the Titanic, so please indulge me. The couple were married in December of 1910, and this was followed by a year-long honeymoon traveling around the capitals of Europe while they waited for their mansion in Madrid to be readied for them. Now, they did stay in Europe the entire time because Victor's mother, who lived in Madrid, who was footing the bill for most of the trip, told them that they could not get on a ship to cross the ocean as it was bad luck to do so on a honeymoon. But when the couple found themselves in Paris in early 1912, advertisements for Titanic were plastered all over the city. And the allure of riding on the ship of dreams, the unsinkable Titanic to New York City was just too much, and so they did book passage. But how to tell Mama? Well, they didn't. See, Maria Josefa's maid would go along with them, but Victor's butler was to stay in Paris along with a stack of pre-written postcards from Paris telling about all of the wonderful romantic adventures that they were having. Then the butler could send these periodically to Victor's mother to keep her in the dark. So with their plan in motion, they boarded Titanic at Cherbourg. Now the couple, who spoke little to no English, were nonetheless a hit. A fellow first-class passenger wrote, "The little Spanish bride and her husband were just like little canaries. They were so loving and were having such a happy honeymoon that everyone on the Titanic became interested in them." Well, after enjoying a lavish dinner in the first-class dining saloon on the night of April 14th, the couple went back to their room to ready for bed, while Fermina, their maid, was in her cabin mending a corset. And while she was doing her needlework, she felt a slight vibration, and then the engine stopped. And so she decided to go to her employer's cabin and see if they had felt anything. People were starting to stir out in the corridor, and even though the staff told them that there was nothing to worry about, Victor, who was still dressed, decided to go up onto the boat deck just to check it out. When he went up there, he saw crew members readying the lifeboats. So he immediately went back down to his cabin and told both of the ladies to get dressed and head on up. Now, when they arrived up on deck, the band, which had been playing at their dinner just a couple hours earlier, had come out onto the boat deck to play some upbeat music to alleviate the worries of anxious passengers. And Victor tried to figure out exactly what was going on and how to get them to a lifeboat, but he didn't really know English, and so it was very confused. And frankly, even if you did know English, the entire situation was very confused. Luckily, the nearby Countess of Roths, who knew some French, was able to lead them through the crowd to Lifeboat 8. Of course, at this time, it was still very much women and children first, and so Victor knew that he could not accompany his wife into the lifeboat. So he embraced her and then, in Spanish, said, "Pepita, may you be very happy." Then he put his wife and her maid into the lifeboat with the Countess and stepped back onto the deck. And then he watched as lifeboat number 8, which was less than half full, lowered into the sea. The Countess of Roths, who took control of the tiller in the lifeboat, later wrote, "Then Senora de Satorre Peñasco began to scream for her husband. It was too horrible. I left the tiller to my cousin and slipped down beside her to be of what comfort I could. Poor woman. Her sobs tore our hearts, and her moans were unspeakable in their sadness. When the awful end came, I tried my best to keep the Spanish woman from hearing the agonizing sound of distress. They seemed to continue forever, although it could not have been more than 10 minutes until the silence of a lonely sea dropped down. The indescribable loneliness, the ghastliness of our feelings can never be told." But it was actually after the sinking that 2 more tragic events took place. First, the butler did not know of his employer's fate, and so continued to send postcards that had these fictitious stories of their wonderful life and honeymoon and romantic adventures in Paris. And he would send these to his mother. And even weeks after his mother found out that her son was dead, postcards kept coming in the mail. The second tragedy was that, according to Spanish law at the time, without a body, Victor could not be declared dead for 20 years. That would put his wife in her 40s before she could get any inheritance of hers or his, or until she could remarry. So Victor's family did what I think any of us would have done and bribed someone who was part of the effort to get the bodies out of the Atlantic. It was all happening in Canada, and they basically found a body that hadn't been identified and paid someone to let the maid go and identify that body as Victor. This allowed Maria Josefa to remarry a few years later, and her maid actually stayed with her throughout the rest of their lives pretty much, and they both lived long and happy lives. And I just love these little stories from that event. And that's why I keep returning to Titanic. All through my life I keep returning to Titanic, but That's why I'm returning to it here on the show, just for one episode right now. But if you're not sick of Titanic, then maybe I'll do it once or twice a year. A lot of food, a lot of stories from Titanic to cover. Or if there are any other topics that you want me to cover, any events that you want me to talk about, I will gladly add those to the list. But for now, it's time to make some shirred eggs. So the recipe for shirred eggs that I'm using comes from Fanny Farmer, and she says to mix some melted butter with breadcrumbs. Then line the bottom of a ramekin with a bit of the breadcrumbs. She also says you can actually scoop out a tomato and line the bottom of that with breadcrumbs. Either way, gently slip 1 or 2 broken eggs into the cup, then sprinkle with salt and pepper, cover with buttered crumbs, and bake. I put them in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about 15 minutes, but it's gonna kind of depend on the eggs and what they're in, so you're just looking for a slight wobble. Then we add that to the rest of our breakfast, and here we are. A first-class breakfast aboard the RMS Titanic. So I'm just gonna kind of go in order of the menu, so I'm gonna start with the baked apple. Let's try it. I mean, oh my God, that's good. What is not to like? It is apple and sugar and butter and cinnamon. It's basically, it tastes like an apple pie without any crust. And now I just wish I had made like a dozen of these. That's wonderful, and I could eat that for breakfast every day. And for these smoked salmon cornets, I love smoked salmon. What's not to like? It's delicious, nice and cold. I like it when it's very cold. Yeah, fantastic. Now, unfortunately, the next thing I should eat is the shirred eggs, but I tried them right as they came out of the oven because she says to eat them right when they come out, so I figured I would try them. And it turns out my, at one time, very mild allergy to egg whites has become a not so mild allergy to egg whites, and I'm not going to put myself through that again, so I'm not going to try it. Suffice it to say, they were creamy and kind of had a wonderful crunch from the breadcrumbs, and then my mouth swelled up, so I couldn't eat anymore. But they were fantastic. Not entirely sure how I'm going to tackle things going forward because, well, I was planning on doing deviled eggs soon, but maybe I can just eat the inside. I don't know. And it's weird because if it's like baked in a cake, it's fine, but when it's just the egg white, bad things happen. So instead, I'm going to move right to the buckwheat cakes, and traditionally these would be served with syrup, but I want to just try it without anything just to get the flavor because they look very different than a normal pancake. They taste very different from a normal pancake. Buckwheat is such a healthy flavor, we'll say that. What I do love though is that little bit of sourness from the yeast that rose overnight. And so I would definitely make these with I would just use regular flour. I don't like buckwheat flour all that much. It's just such a strong flavor. It would take a lot of syrup to kind of overcome that. But I know some people that really love it, so if you love it, then make buckwheat cakes. Now I do also want to try both the black currant conserve and the vintage Oxford marmalade. And this is actually the brand that they had on the ship. This one is not, but this is the brand that they had on the ship, and you can get it still and it says vintage Oxford marmalade. They have different types. The vintage kind, it's much darker than modern marmalade tends to be. Here you can see the color, but it's very dark and it's very bitter. At first it's like really sweet, but then it becomes bitter, and it's the bitterness that stays in your mouth. And I wish it was the other way around. It was like bitter and then it's pleasantly sweet. It's the other way around. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a punishment in my eyes at the end. But this, on the other hand, I mean, I could have that on bread 3 meals a day. Fantastic. The seeds definitely get caught in your teeth. Yeah, they're gonna be there all day now, but that was just a little bit too. But it's so good. It has this slight, what I associate with medicine, like a medicinal flavor, but in the best of possible ways. I don't mean that in a bad way at all. It's more of like, it recalls medicine, but delicious. Now at the very end of the meal, they would have some watercress. It was thought at the time, and I think it still is, to help with digestion, and it was very popular. Tastes like watercress. You know, kind of a wonderfully earthy green. I don't know how they would have had it, but I think just plain. Sometimes they would put in a salad in other recipes, but I think here it would just be plain. It's interesting. There's also like a spiciness to it. That took a second. So overall, everything was delicious, but the baked apple kind of takes the cake or the pie. For me, you should definitely make that one. Everything else, wonderful, the smoked salmon and everything, but yeah, the baked apple, definitely make that. It's really easy. When most people think of the Hindenburg, they think of this. But I have two questions. One, why was this giant piece of Nazi propaganda, because that's actually what it was, floating over New Jersey in the first place? And two, what did they eat? Well, I'm going to answer the first question a little bit later, but the answer to the second question is really fancy food, like Pears Condé with chocolate sauce. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we dine on the Hindenburg, this time on Tasting History. So first off, if this topic is interesting to you, then might I suggest this book. It's Dan Grossman's book on the Hindenburg. It's wonderfully illustrated. He knows absolutely everything about the subject, and it's just really well done. So I'll put a link to that and his website in the description. So the largest rigid airship ever constructed, the Hindenburg, named after Germany's president, Paul von Hindenburg, had just over 1 year of flying under its belt when, filled with 7 million cubic feet of hydrogen, it exploded over an airfield in Lakehurst, New Jersey on May 6, 1937. But in that short time, it played host to some of the most wealthy and powerful people in the entire world. And the man who was in charge of feeding all of these wealthy and powerful people was 25-year-old Xaver Meyer. The menus he created were meant to convey the flavors of Germany, but often in a French style, which was the fancy style that his customers were accustomed to. One such menu given to passengers when they booked a flight featured dishes such as beef broth with marrow dumplings, Rhine salmon à la Graf Zeppelin, roast gosling la Meunière, and a dessert of Pears Condé with chocolate sauce. And that last one sounded so delicious, that's the one that I decided to make. Now, before he worked on Zeppelins, Meyer was a chef at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. And at that time, they were still cooking from the recipes of Auguste Escoffier. So I went to find Escoffier's recipe for Pears Condé, and at first it seemed rather simple. Poire Condé. Very small pears which are carefully peeled and shaped are most suitable for this preparation. Those of medium size should be cut in half. Cook them in vanilla-flavored syrup, then proceed as for Abricot Condé, recipe 4510. So then you have to flip through and find the recipe for Abricot Condé, which starts out, on a round dish prepare a border of vanilla-flavored prepared rice for sweet dishes, recipe 4470. So then you have to flip to recipe 4470, and after a while it turns out you actually have to find 5 different recipes to make this one dish. But I suppose that's how he fit 5,000 recipes in his cookbook, whereas mine I think has 65. I do have signed copies available, links in the description. Suffice it to say, this turned out to be a really complex dessert, and it's actually best made over the span of 2 days. Now, to save a little bit of time, I've taken the 5 recipes and condensed it all down into one, which is essentially this video. But the first thing we need to do is actually make not the pears, but the rice. It's essentially a vanilla rice pudding. So for this, what you'll need is 1 heaping cup or 250 grams of Carolina rice. He calls for Carolina rice because it plumps up really nice, but it's kind of hard to find, so you can use any good long-grain risotto-worthy rice. 1.5 cups or 300 grams of sugar, a pinch of salt, 1 liter of whole milk, 6 egg yolks, a half vanilla pod or 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla paste, and 3.5 tablespoons or 50 grams of butter. First, rinse the rice and then add it to some boiling water for about 3 minutes, and then pour it out and rinse it again in warm water. Then in a wide pan, add the milk, sugar, salt, and butter, and also scrape the seeds from the vanilla pod in and toss the actual pod in as well. Then set it on the stove and bring it to a boil, and once it starts boiling, remove the vanilla pod and add in the rice, stirring it around to make sure it's evenly distributed. Then let it return to a boil, and as soon as it does, set the lid on the pan and set it in the oven at 325 degrees Fahrenheit, 160 Celsius for, he says, 25 to 30 minutes. I found that is not long enough, at least for mine. It took about 40 minutes, because you do want it to get most of the liquid up into the rice. Once it's ready, take it out of the oven and working quickly, add in the egg yolk and stir it with a fork. You want to be gentle with it because you don't want the rice grains to break up. Then let it cool to room temperature. It'll start to thicken as it does, and then put it in the fridge and let it chill, preferably overnight. Also overnight, he wants you to take some candied fruit cut up small and soak or macerate it in Kirschwasser. Kirschwasser is a brandy made from Morello cherries, and while it does have a slight cherry flavor, it's not sweet at all. Now, he doesn't say exactly what fruit to use in this. I think all versions of the dish kind of do different things, but you can use any candied fruit, but later on we're going to need candied cherries, so you can use those here as well. So that is all of day 1. And before we get to day 2, I want to tell you a little bit about your ride on the Hindenburg. So I think we need to address the elephant in the room, and that would be the tail fins of the Hindenburg. As I said, this ship was basically a giant floating piece of Nazi propaganda. Following its flyover of the Olympics in 1936, it became the talk of the international community, and Germany used it as a way to show that it had bounced back from its defeat in World War I. Germany had produced the world's largest airship, and at 245 meters, it floated along at around 78 miles per hour, delivering passengers from Frankfurt, Germany to New Jersey in just 67 hours. That was half the time that the typical luxury liner of the day, like the Queen Mary, could get you there. But the Queen Mary held over 2,000 passengers, whereas the Hindenburg, even after in 1937 they added more places for people to sleep, held about 70. And even with a one-way ticket price of 1,000 Reichsmarks, which is about $9,000 in today's money, it just wasn't enough people to actually make the Zeppelin turn a profit. But because it was a symbol of German ingenuity, the German government helped prop it up and gave it money just so they could keep this huge piece of Nazi propaganda floating over cities like Boston and New York. But since it didn't need to turn a profit, and it was really there just to impress wealthy foreigners, a ride on the Hindenburg was really top draw. If you experienced it, it felt like being in a dream, like a flying first-class hotel, a 5-star hotel. Everyone on board felt the same way. And it really was in many ways, but not all, because a 5-star earthbound hotel doesn't need to worry about how much things weigh, whereas on an airship, you really have to worry about that. For passengers, this was most evident in their cabins. They were Spartan in decor, and rather than a king-sized mahogany bed with canopy, on the Hindenburg, even the millionaires slept in little more than cots made of aluminum in bunk bed setup. The original rooms on the ship were all on the interior, and so you had no windows, and while you did have a plastic water basin with running hot and cold water, for showers or using the toilet, it was all done communally. There were like 6 passenger toilets, 7 on the entire ship. In 1937, they did add 9 more cabins on B deck, which did have window access, but you were still sharing a toilet with a Rockefeller. Now, even though you might not have a window in your room, it was more than made up for by the massive slanted windows that ran the length of both sides of A deck. Gazing out the windows was one of the highlights of a voyage on the ship because, unlike an airplane that flew at 30,000 feet high, and so looking down you could just see little tiny things, the Hindenburg would glide along between 600 and 700 feet above the ground. So not only could you see the landscape passing by just under you, but as you crossed the North Atlantic, you could be so close to things like icebergs that you could almost reach out and touch them. You shouldn't, but you almost felt like you could. And perhaps the most exciting view was passing by the city skylines, where you might be level with the top of the Empire State Building. And since it was floating, there was never any serious turbulence, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the 4 Daimler-Benz diesel engines. Now, should you get bored just staring out of a window for hours at a time, there were other things on board to keep you busy. It was hard sometimes to realize during the trip that one was not on an ocean liner, but instead high in the air. The spacious social hall, dining hall, writing saloon, and even the diminutive bar and smoking room all conveyed the illusion of a seafaring craft. Yes, people in the 1930s were avid letter writers, and so they had an entire room just dedicated to the craft. And should you actually want to post a letter from the Hindenburg, they had a Hindenburg stamp, and the mail would be sent as soon as you landed. Now, if letter writing isn't your bag, then the starboard lounge on A deck might be more your speed. Decorated in a contemporary style, which frankly reminds me of a hospital waiting room, the main wall of the lounge depicted a large map of the world marked with the routes of history's great explorers. In the corner was a piano, but as weight was such a concern, it was custom built by the Blvd Piano Company and was made of a lightweight aluminum and copper alloy weighing only 356 pounds, which isn't that heavy considering it's a piano. Now, this was the 1930s, and so people couldn't be expected not to smoke even if they were in a giant balloon filled with hydrogen. So they custom built a smoking room down on B deck. You'd go down and request the use of the single electric lighter from the steward and then enter the smoking room, which was fitted with a double airlock and was kept pressurized at a higher level than the rest of the ship to keep any leaking hydrogen out of that room. This is also where the bar was, and so it's no surprise it was one of the most popular spots on the ship. One passenger recalled that the smoking room is the rendezvous before and after meals, presided over by Max, a steward who makes excellent cocktails and watches everyone like a hawk to see that none inadvertently leaves with a lighted cigar or cigarette. The doors are so arranged that not more than one person can enter or leave at the same time. Then, after your cocktail and cigarette, it was time to eat. Now, there was only one dining room on the ship. It was on A deck, and it spanned the entire length of the port side, about 47 feet long and 13 feet wide. The walls were decorated with paintings on silk wallpaper which depicted scenes from Graf Zeppelin's flights to South America, and the chairs, made from ultra-light tubular aluminum, were upholstered in red. 3 meals a day were served on fine blue and white porcelain china, crystal stemware, and the best sterling silver available. Then the tables were lined with white linen and decorated with fresh flowers. I find it a little odd that they were so concerned about weight and yet had sterling silver and crystal, which weigh quite a bit, but I guess they were deemed necessary. What was not deemed necessary were napkins, because you only got one napkin, not per meal, per voyage. When you arrived on the airship, you would receive an envelope with a white linen napkin in it, and that thing followed you around to all of your meals. Now, with your single white napkin ready to go, out came the food. The ship carried more than 2 tons of food per crossing, which included 400 pounds of fresh meat and poultry, 220 pounds of fish, 440 pounds of potatoes, 800 eggs, and 40 gallons of milk, among other things like live lobsters and, being German, 330 pounds of sausage and cold cuts. They also carried hundreds of bottles of German beer and wine. These seem to have been the most popular drinks on board, but they did have a fully stocked bar with a number of cocktails, including a signature cocktail called the LZ-129 Frosted Cocktail, LZ-129 Hindenburg being the full official name of the ship. Though frankly, as this cocktail seems to have just been equal parts gin and orange juice, I kind of feel like the bartender was phoning it in on that one. Now, that was one of the only things that you ever had to pay for, were these cocktails, because everything else was included. All the food, all the other drink, everything. You didn't even need to carry around cash to tip, because as a brochure that you'd get told you, the personnel on board is not permitted to accept tips at any time. At meals, this personnel would include the chief steward and about 6 different servers. Each day from 8 to 10 a.m., the servers would set out a breakfast of eggs, sausage and ham, assorted rolls and pastries, coffee and tea. And at this meal, the passengers would receive a menu letting them know what they were going to have for luncheon and dinner. The meals are delicious. Luncheon consisted of soup, fish, chicken breast with rice, peas, asparagus tips, ice cream, cake, and coffee. Dinner, consommé, fish, tenderloin of beef on toast with mushrooms, potatoes, salad, charlotte russe with coffee. This was the typical fare aboard the Hindenburg, but since weight was such a concern, you didn't order things off the menu, you simply got everything, but everybody only had one choice when they sat down to a meal. Everybody got the same thing. But since there were so many foods available, surely there was something that you would like. Now, the food tended to be very heavy, with cream soups and dishes like venison cutlets Blvd, Bavarian-style fatted duckling served with a buttery cream sauce, and vegetable dishes also served with a cream sauce. And then at luncheon, this was always finished with a show-stopping dessert like the one that we're making today, and usually at dinner it was something a little simpler like a fruit and cheese plate. Now, the dishes were so heavy that Americans at the time often complained that they couldn't stomach all of that heavy cream sauce. How things have changed. And so, one of the German representatives of the company, or an American representative of the company, suggested that at the bottom of the menu that they got at breakfast, they should include the note, "We would be happy to prepare an omelet for you if there is nothing on the menu that appeals to you." And whether it was an omelet or one of these fancy desserts or anything else, it was all prepared in the kitchen on electric stoves and ovens, because they didn't want any gas appliances because they were more likely to cause a fire. And a fire aboard a hydrogen-filled Zeppelin is the nightmare scenario. A nightmare scenario that came true on May 6, 1937. The last voyage of the Hindenburg began like many others, leaving from Frankfurt, Germany on May 3rd with 36 passengers and 61 crew. It was headed to America, but as soon as it got out over the North Atlantic, strong headwinds slowed its progress. Now, this was not an issue for safety or even comfort, because the Hindenburg famously had no turbulence. To all our passengers, the safety, comfort, freedom from sickness, and tranquility of motion are a revelation, and these features no doubt are the reason for the increasing popularity of travel by airship. The one regret expressed by our passengers, with which we are familiar, is that the voyage is over so soon. Only this voyage wasn't over so soon because of that wind slowing the ship's progress, and so it was about 12 hours behind schedule getting into New Jersey. Now, typically this wouldn't be a big deal, except that there were reporters waiting for the Hindenburg to arrive because this was kind of being treated as a one-year anniversary of the ship coming to America. Also, it needed to turn around and head back to Europe right after it landed, with some of the most wealthy and important people in both Germany and America, because they were headed to Europe for the coronation of King George VI, which was on May 12th. So with the pressure on, the captain, Max Pruss, hurried the ship in its obligatory circle around Manhattan before heading on to New Jersey, where he could land a full 12 hours behind schedule. The only issue was that there was a thunderstorm. And now, typically, a thunderstorm wasn't a problem. The Hindenburg had actually been struck by lightning on multiple occasions when it was up in the air. It had even burned off some of the cloth that covered it. The only time that it was an issue was if they were venting hydrogen, which they need to do when they land the ship. So the manual strictly forbids landing the Zeppelin during a thunderstorm. But with the eyes of the world on him, especially the eyes from Berlin, Captain Pruss was really needing to get this ship landed and get it back on schedule. Finally, at 6:12 p.m., the commanding officer on the ground at the Lakehurst Naval Air Station radioed up, saying, "Conditions now considered suitable for landing. Ground crew is ready." Unfortunately, the ship, killing time, had kind of gone out of the way and was now 30 miles south of Lakehurst, and so it didn't actually get to Lakehurst until 7:09 p.m. Then at 7:21, the crew dropped the moor lines to the ground crew 290 feet below. Then these lines would be attached to winches to pull the airship down to the ground so passengers could get off. But before it did that, at 7:25, crew members in the tail fin heard a dull pop and saw a spark and a flame above them. A fire had broken out while they were venting hydrogen, and almost instantaneously, one of the fuel cells exploded. Now, the ship was so large that only those in the back or those on the ground watching knew what had happened, because most people just felt it kind of as a rumble or a jolt. Even the captain thought maybe they had just lost or broke a line. In the crew mess, a 14-year-old cabin boy, Werner Franz, who was the youngest crew member aboard, he was securing dishes and silverware when it happened. The first thing I noticed was a huge bang and a strong vibration in the ship. Within seconds, the room tilted forward and he fell, and he saw flames coming in through the ceiling above him. And then a water tank burst, dousing him with water and kind of jolting him out of his shock, and he ran toward a service hatch that led directly out. It's where they brought food into the mess, and he leapt into it, and as it was in free fall, I hung there. Then I jumped from a height of about 4 or 5 meters, ran under the ship and out the other side. The head chef, Zavamaya, had seen the boy do this, and so he quickly followed him and again dropped to the ground virtually unharmed. He can actually be seen in a photo leaving the scene with the wreckage behind him, ironically smoking a cigarette. Many others found escape through the windows on the port side where the restaurant was, because the ship listed that way, and so people could jump out to the ground. Now what's scary is all of this happened in a matter of about 15 seconds. It's thought that from the explosion to the point where you could get out of the ship alive, you had 15 seconds to act. The speed of having to make these horrible decisions of jumping out of the window is most evident in the story of a family who was aboard the ship. Hermann Döner, who managed a pharmaceutical company in Mexico City, was traveling back with his family from Germany where they had been on holiday. And it was him, his wife Matilda, and 3 of their children, Irene, Walter, and Werner. Now Mrs. Döner and the 3 children were actually on that promenade next to the restaurant, watching out of the windows, and that's when they felt the place shudder, and then it lurched, and they were thrown against the back wall of the restaurant. As the ship began to settle, she saw 2 crew members, 2 stewards, jump out of the window, and she decided they needed to follow. And so she grabbed her children and ran toward the window. Fritz Dieg, who was one of the stewards who had jumped out, was on the ground shouting up to her to leap out of the window. So she grabs Walter, who was 10, and throws him out of the window. He falls about 15 feet, and Fritz catches him and tosses him aside so he doesn't get hit by falling wreckage. Then it was 8-year-old Werner's turn, and he was already on fire, his hair and his clothes, when she picked him up and threw him out, but the ship kept moving, and so he got knocked around and fell back in, and on the second try, she tossed him out, and he also made it to the ground. Then Mrs. Döner turned to her 14-year-old daughter, Irene, who was in shock and asking where their father was, because he was back in their cabin. She wouldn't jump. So Mrs. Döner tried to force her to, but she was 14, she was just too heavy. And the girl turned and ran back into the ship, probably to find her father. Now, you have to think, again, this is all happening in the span of seconds. And Mrs. Döner has to make the decision, do I follow my daughter to almost certain death, or do I follow my 2 sons, saving myself for them? And that's what she did. She leapt out, fell, she hurt herself as she did, but she survived. Now, against all odds, Irene was found. Again, only a minute after the explosion, rescuers were running into the burning wreckage, and one of them found Irene. She was seated at a dining table, and she was on fire. And he got her and took her out. And unfortunately, she did die of her burns later that night. The father, Hermann, he was found much later, and he also had died. Honestly, when you watch the footage of the disaster, it's hard to believe that anyone survived. Those on the ground, reporters and family alike, none of them expected that anyone could survive what they were watching. It's why Herb Morrison's famous broadcast is just so emotional.
It's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around it. I told you, I can't even talk to people. His friends are on there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen. Honest, it's just laying there a massive smoking wreckage.
But in the end, 62 of the 97 people on board the Hindenburg did survive. What did not survive was the airships. The day after the Hindenburg disaster, the Graf Zeppelin landed safely in Germany after flying from Brazil, and this was the last international passenger airship flight. They were used somewhat in World War II, but after that, they were all but gone. And today, obviously not filled with hydrogen, they're only used for the occasional advertising over football games. And while a ride on the Goodyear blimp might be fun, I'm guessing that they don't feed you on fancy things like the pears condé with chocolate sauce that I need to finish making. So the recipe calls for small pears, and that is what I used, but these are really hard to find, so you can use the smallest pear that you can find and just cut it in half. But you want them to be firm. You don't want them to be fully ripe yet, because they're going to soften as we cook them. What you do want to do is peel them. You can do this by scalding them and then putting them in cold water and the skin will come off, or if you just have a few, it's just faster to hand peel them. Then make a syrup with 1.5 cups or 300 grams of sugar, 5 cups or 1.2 liters of water, and 1/2 vanilla pod or 1.5 teaspoons of vanilla paste. Mix it all up and heat it over medium heat until it becomes a syrup, and then drop in the pears and simmer for 15 minutes. For Escoffier's chocolate sauce, take 250 grams of semi-sweet chocolate and add 1 3/4 cup or 400 milliliters of water and 1 tablespoon of vanilla sugar. If you don't have vanilla sugar, you should get some because it's absolutely delicious, but in a pinch you can just use some regular sugar. Then set that over medium heat and let the chocolate melt and simmer the sauce for 25 minutes, and then stir in 3 tablespoons of heavy cream and 1 tablespoon of butter. Let it melt and then take it off the heat. Then go get your rice out of the refrigerator and put it into a mold of some sort, or just dish it up, and then set some of that candied fruit that was macerated in the Kirschwasser on top of it, and then set your poached pears on top of that. Add several candied cherries. You can use either maraschino cherries or the really nice little dark cherries that they put in like a good old-fashioned or something like that, and then put the chocolate on top. And here we are, pears condé with chocolate sauce. I mean, none of this doesn't look appetizing. So let me start with the pears. Try a bit. Yeah, it's nice and soft. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna get it all. I'm gonna just get it all. Here we go. Oh my God. That is so good, y'all. Wow, it's a lot of work, but oh, the flavors. So you just want a little bit of chocolate sauce because the flavor of the pear is so light. You don't want it overwhelmed by the chocolate. I think you could probably leave off the fruit if you don't want that. I mean, not the pears, obviously you want that. But so a little bit of chocolate and that pear, and then I'm gonna just try the rice real quick. That's amazing. I mean, it's essentially rice pudding, but with a really strong vanilla flavor that makes it just, it tastes like luxury. It tastes like you're dining on the Hindenburg. Yeah, and with the chocolate and that combined, fantastic. Honestly, if you want, you can just make the rice pudding. That is worthy of a dessert in and of itself if you want to do things a little faster. Also, before I go, I just wanted to thank everyone for watching this channel and subscribing. We just hit 2 million subscribers, which is just mind-boggling. I never expected that food history would take off like it did. I'm just so glad that I found my audience and y'all found me. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Today on most domestic flights, you're lucky to get a bag of pretzels and a ginger ale. But back in the golden age of air travel, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, pretty much every ticket came with a luxurious meal. Meals like this one from United Airlines in 1954, which includes pot roast, Delmonico potatoes, and a heavenly delight salad. So thank you to Trade Coffee for sponsoring this video as we fly the friendly skies, this time on Tasting History. So based on the age of most of my audience, I'm going to guess that you didn't get to fly during the golden age of air travel. Neither did I. I'm not quite that old, but I did get to be around for some of the vestiges of the golden age, like getting to go into the cockpit as a kid and have the wings put on me by the pilot himself. But when it came to food, I wasn't around for any of the good stuff. It was always just peanuts and Coke. And frankly, it's probably a good thing because the quality of airline food when I was a kid was not great. But that was not always the case, because like in the 1950s and 60s, airlines prided themselves on the quality of food that they were serving. That's because during the time, prices of tickets were regulated, so they couldn't compete on price, so they had to compete in other ways. Basically, how to make the flight actually more pleasant for the passengers, and one big thing was food. And today I can actually travel back in time and try some of that luxurious food with this. This is a cookbook that was put out in 1954 by United Airlines. It's called Favorite Recipes of Mainliner Chefs. And today I've chosen 3 dishes from this book so I can create an entire meal that would have been served on an airplane in 1954. First is a beef pot roast by Chef Emile Saltzman from the New York Flight Kitchen, then the Delmonico potatoes by Chef Marc Grugier of the Honolulu Kitchen, and finally the Heavenly Delight salad by Chef Edward Gerber of the Washington, D.C. Flight Kitchen. And the Flight Kitchen is where they would actually prepare the food before they would put it on the plane just before takeoff. Now, the second 2 recipes are pretty simple, but the first recipe has a lot of ingredients. So for the pot roast, what you're going to need is 2.5 pounds of beef chuck or round, 1 pound of veal bones. Finding veal bones is quite the struggle, so just use beef bones. 2 cups of beef stock, 2 medium onions quartered, 6 ounces of tomato paste, 2 bay leaves, 1 sprig of parsley, 1 cup of diced carrots, a half cup diced celery, 6 whole cloves, 10 whole peppercorns, 2 teaspoons of minced garlic, 2 tablespoons of butter or other fat, 1 cup of dry red wine, and then some flour and salt and pepper to taste. And as always, I'm going to have these recipes all up on the Tasting History website with metrics so you can follow along at home. So first, Chef Emile has you season the meat with plenty of salt and pepper and then dredge it in flour. Then melt the butter in a large pot and then add the meat and the marrow bones and let the meat sear for several minutes on one side and then flip it over and let it get some color on the other. Once it's lightly browned all over, add in the onions, celery, carrots, parsley, whole cloves, bay leaves, and peppercorns and let it cook for about 15 minutes. Then add the garlic, stock, tomato paste, and the wine, and then stir everything together and let it come to a simmer. Then put the lid on and let it cook at a simmer for about 2 hours or until the meat is just falling apart. And you can use your trade coffee to make Irish coffee, which was actually invented for the airlines, or by someone working for the airlines. It was invented in 1943 for passengers of a flying boat at Foynes Air Base in Ireland. Supposedly, a bunch of disgruntled passengers got off a plane, so the chef there just took some coffee and put some whiskey in it to calm everybody down, and there we have the Irish coffee. And you can drink some coffee, Irish or otherwise, while you make your Delmonico potatoes. For that, you'll need 8 medium potatoes, peeled and chopped, a half cup chopped pimentos, 2 cups half and half, and then some salt and pepper and plenty of Parmesan cheese to cover the top. So first, mix the potatoes with the pimentos, and then add a teaspoon and a half of salt and a teaspoon of pepper to the half and half, and set it on the stove to heat up just until it simmers. Then pour all of that over the potatoes, making sure the potatoes are covered, and then set the dish in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about an hour and a half, or until the potatoes are totally cooked through. Then take it out of the oven, up the oven to 400 degrees, sprinkle a bunch of Parmesan cheese to cover the top, and return it to the oven for 5 more minutes or until the top is melted and lightly browned. Now before we make our Heavenly Delight salad, which really stretches the definition of a salad, make sure you subscribe to Tasting History, hit that like button, it really helps the channel, and let's talk about the history of airline food. So before we get into the history, I want to mention this wonderful resource that I used called Food in the Air and Space by Richard Foss. It's a wonderful deep dive into the history of food in the air, not just airlines, but in space, and even he goes all the way back to the 18th century with hot air balloons. It's fantastic. You should check it out if you are interested in this topic. I am not going all the way back to the 18th century. I am starting just after World War I in 1919, where on October 11th, the first meal on a commercial airline was served during a Handley Page flight from Paris to London. This was a prepackaged lunchbox with a sandwich and a piece of fruit, and just like Spirit Airlines today, food was not included in the price of the ticket, so you had to shell out 3 shillings for this cold lunch. And pretty much for the next decade, all meals on planes were cold. Like the Western Air Express meals on flights between Los Angeles and San Francisco, where cold fried chicken, potato salad, and sandwiches were catered by the Los Angeles-based Pig and Whistle, which sadly only closed a couple years ago. The same year that they were serving cold fried chicken, 1928, Lufthansa upped the ante with the first hot in-flight meal on flights from Berlin to Paris, where the food was made on the ground and then kept warm in insulated containers. This began airlines' increasing desire to provide passengers with the best and most cutting-edge cuisine available. The issue was keeping it warm because, especially on a longer flight, those insulated containers just didn't really cut it. And so if you wanted to heat the food up on the plane, you had to have an oven built on the plane, and most planes just weren't that big. But the flying boats of the 1930s were. And Pan American Airlines, Pan Am, installed galleys on many of their clippers so they could not only reheat the food, but actually cook it. They even had a dedicated dining room aboard with tables and white tablecloths, so it was more like eating in an actual restaurant. United Airlines soon followed suit and began installing kitchens on their planes where they would serve not cold but hot fried chicken as well as freshly scrambled eggs. This is also around the time when United Airlines really began priding themselves on the quality of their food. By the way, this is not sponsored by United Airlines, just talk about history. Maybe it would have been nice if they had sponsored it, though once I get to the part about flight attendants, stewardesses, and how they train them, they'd probably revoke that sponsorship. We'll get to that. Anyway, United made a huge leap forward in the quality of airline food in 1936 when in Oakland, California, they opened up their first flight kitchen. They hired top chefs to design a menu worthy of a wonderful luxury restaurant on the ground, but with the idea that these dishes could be served in the air. Far more elaborate dishes could be made this way by preparing them on the ground rather than in the air, and that is what they called their mainliner cuisine, and that is actually what we're cooking from today. It's those dishes that they created. Other airlines quickly followed suit, and menus from this time period really show how fancy airline food could get. Mignon of veal with Russian sauce, Boston cream pie, or an entire Irish-themed meal on St. Patrick's Day 1940 with a Dublin-style Lego lamb stew. European airlines were going extra fine dining by serving everything from lobster to foie gras to peach melba. Now, the next big technological leap came, as many technological leaps do, from a military contract. During World War II, William Maxon, or rather his company, developed several inventions for the US military. In addition to the Maxon multiple gun mount, which airlines never seem to have adopted, his company developed the Maxon whirlwind oven, which by circulating the air in the oven would heat things more evenly and much quicker. This was essentially the first convection oven, and it was designed to fit these meals called Maxon sky plates, which were served on airplanes for the Navy and the Army during the war and afterward. Then after the war, Pan American Airlines took these ovens and installed them on many of their commercial planes so that they could get rid of the full kitchen or have the food that was being brought on heated at a much quicker pace. It was also during the war that several airlines hired their first all-female flight attendant crews. Now, there had been female flight attendants, or stewardesses as they were called, since 1930. But during the war, the lack of men saw the female stewardess become the standard for quite some time. In fact, in subsequent decades, many airlines refused to hire men for the job at all. And they started using the female stewardesses as a selling point to their clientele, who were mostly men, basically saying, hey, you want your food and drink served by a pretty lady. Now, this meant that stewardesses really had to become the ultimate service provider. Back in the 30s and even the early 40s, you actually had to be a registered nurse to become a flight attendant, but by the 50s, the airlines were doing all of that training themselves. As can be seen in this one ad from United Airlines, told you we'd get back to this, where they boast. 2 months ago, Sherry Woodruff couldn't even balance a cup of coffee. She was friendly, intelligent, and attractive, and wanted more than anything else to be a great stewardess. But then she had 5.5 weeks at United's Stewardesses School. We taught Sherry how to serve a gourmet dinner, how to soothe a first flyer, how to apply everything from makeup to first aid. Today she can warm a baby's formula with one hand and pour 4 cups of coffee with the other. They actually use these ads to entice young women to apply to learn the skills not of a great stewardess, but of a great housewife. They even went so far as to imply that on one of the flights is the best place for you to secure a husband, as can be seen in this 1967 ad. Old maid, that's what the other United Airlines stewardesses call her, because she's been flying for almost 3 years now. The average tenure of a United stewardess is only 21 months before she gets married. Maybe that's why more people fly United than any other airline. Everyone gets warmth, friendliness, and extra care, and someone may get a wife. Of course, as soon as they did get married, United would fire them, and that wasn't deemed illegal until 1971. They also had a mandatory retirement age of 30. Now, during the 50s and 60s, the airlines would actually use the stewardesses and the cuisine in tandem to sell passengers on their flights, especially with something they called themed flights. Like TWA had foreign accent flights. These were themed Italian, French, Old English, and Manhattan penthouse. The flight attendants wore costumes. Like the English flight, they would wear like a wench costume, and then they would also play music from whatever country it was, and of course, the cuisine was from the country as well. Northwest Airlines really doubled down on these theme flights with something called the Fujiyama Room. On October 30th, 1955, they debuted these rooms featuring kitschy Asian decor on a number of planes, and they would serve food like shrimp, cheese, and fruit out of a pineapple with little umbrellas sticking out of it. It was sort of like Japan and tiki culture mashed up, thereby ruining both. Then there was Western Airlines' Hunt Breakfast flights from 1957. This was styled in the tradition of an Old English hunt breakfast, basically having breakfast out while you're hunting. And so all the food was themed that way too, but when it came to the sounds, it would be barking dogs and bugles. Now perhaps no flight married the idea of the pretty stewardess and the quality cuisine better than United Airlines' executive flight, something I'm sure the company would like to forget. These flew from 1953 to 1970 and were men only. Women were not allowed to purchase a ticket on these flights. Aimed at the executive businessmen of New York and Chicago, these flights would take off every day at 5 p.m., flying between the two cities. And there's an ad from the time that lets you know exactly what you can expect. United Airlines invites you to fly the Chicago Executive, a club in the sky for men only. You'll enjoy the informal club-like atmosphere, smoke your pipe or cigar if you wish, and make yourself more comfortable by using the pair of slippers provided. Enjoy congenial company in the lounge. A full-course steak dinner is table served by the two stewardesses aboard. It's a delicious meal prepared by the experienced continental chefs. Now, it wasn't just these themed flights, but really all flights of the 1950s and 60s that tried to up their game when it came not just to food, but just luxury in general. The seats became cushier than ever, often fully reclining, or on some longer flights, there would be an entire berth with a lay-down bed like you'd expect on a train or on one of the really top luxury airlines of today. And this is when the food really became a spectacle. There was a TWA flight where they would roll a trolley down the aisle with a whole piece of roast beef where they would slice it off and you'd be served roast beef au jus right there from the aisle. Other trolleys would include chilled seafood like lobster and crab legs. There were fresh fruit trays, salads and charcuterie, and even a dessert cart where they would make a sundae right in front of you. Bring that back. I'm starting a petition. Now, one of the most splendid setups for food actually came from Scandinavian Airlines, where they offered the Scandinavian country-style buffet during the late 60s, where they would carve a ham right there in the aisle. Now, while the food was getting more splendid, that doesn't actually mean it was getting better, because the flavor of the food wasn't exactly what it was on the ground. First of all, if it was made on the ground and then kept on the plane and then having to be reheated, you're essentially eating really fancy leftovers. But another big thing was that we don't taste the same when we're up in an airplane. Partly it's because the real lack of humidity messes with our sense of smell and hence our sense of taste. So you're not tasting the food as much as you would on the ground. So they started adding a lot more salt and sugar to their recipes to compensate. But while that may have helped with the flavor of the food, there was something else coming along in airline travel that would really screw up the service, and that was the adoption of jets. Airlines began switching over to jets, which went much faster than the earlier airplanes, and this meant that the 7-course meal often served even on domestic flights was becoming a thing of the past, at least in economy. Sometimes in first class now, I guess you get it, but even so, everything had to be sped up. The shorter service time also led to most airplanes swapping out glassware and china for plastic trays and plastic forks, because unlike the china, you didn't have to clean it right then and kind of stack it nicely, which took a lot of time, but rather you could just toss it in a bin and deal with it when you landed. Though this was published in 1954, and they're already eating off of plastic, so, you know, it was a gradual change. And all of these changes going on gave airline food a new reputation of being rubbery and bland. There's actually a wonderful musical from 1965 called Do I Hear a Waltz? And there's a whole song about the travails of airline travel at the time, and there's part that is all about the food. The shiny stuff is tomatoes, the salad lies in a group. The curly stuff is potatoes, the stuff that moves is soup. Anything that is white is sweet, anything that is brown is meat, anything that is gray, don't eat. And, that was kind of the reputation for the next few decades. Of course, this change in the quality of the cuisine really only affected the economy class or coach class. And nothing exemplifies this kind of divide between coach and first class at the time better than the Great Sandwich War. See, it was 1958, and the International Air Transport Association, who made sure that all planes around the world were following the same rules, decided to allow for the first economy tickets to be purchased in transatlantic flights. But because they were going to be less expensive than the average ticket, they had to take stuff away, and this meant that nobody got any hot food who purchased this. All they could get was a sandwich. But there was Pan Am, an American airline, who said that a sandwich was some meat with bread, and then there were the European sandwiches, and they went all out. You'd get 5 slices of ox tongue, a lettuce heart, asparagus, and sliced carrots on a slice of bread. Or 5 slices of liver pate, fried crisp bacon, mushrooms, and sliced tomato on a slice of bread. Basically, it was a whole meal on a slice of bread, so it was a sandwich. And Pan Am was like, well, they're using that to their advantage. We're supposed to be on an even playing field, so the association had to come up with a definition of a sandwich. A sandwich must be cold, largely of bread or something similar, unadorned, self-contained, and must not include such fillings as caviar, oysters, or lobster. Basically, give the economy class passengers the meagerest food that you can possibly find, a theme which is still with us today. But should you have been able to afford a first-class fare, then the great meals would have continued. And should you have gobs of money available to you, then starting in 1969, you could book passage on the Concorde. The Concorde flew between cities in Western Europe and the East Coast of the US and did so at twice the speed of sound, which would get you to your destination in just 3.5 hours. Now, these were flown mostly by British Airways and Air France, and the cost of a ticket, depending on the time, could cost as much as 30 times the average price of an economy ticket. But for that, you got there a lot faster, and you got quite the meal. What followed the coffee was a breakfast of fresh papaya, guava, pineapple, strawberries, and mangoes, croissants and brioche that might have come from a Paris bakery, a pretty good approximation of eggs Benedict, and a soufflé gruyère, all washed down with Piper Heidsieck cuvée diplomatique. The china, of course, was Limoges. What really ended the splendid food of airlines, as well as the golden age of air travel itself, was the age of deregulation, which started in 1978. Airfare had been regulated for decades, making it so that the only way the airlines had to compete was through perks like wonderful food and their flight attendants or stewardesses, leg room, the comfort, entertainment, or those flights where they had dogs and bugles playing throughout the cabin, that hunt breakfast. I wouldn't like that. But with the deregulation, they could start to do price wars, and this was good and bad. The good part was that it dramatically lowered the price of airfare. For instance, this TWA list of flights from 1955 shows that a flight from Boston to Los Angeles cost $106. That's about $1,200 in today's money. Also, since planes were a lot slower at the time and had to make multiple stops, that flight took 12 hours. No thanks. But these price drops made it so a lot more people had flying available to them. But that also meant that the quality of the flight would, of course, go down. More seats in planes were required to make up for lower fares, which meant a far less comfortable flight, and there were also fewer options for food, and on many flights, no food at all. This is when Southwest distinguished themselves as the peanut airline, and for most of my childhood, I recall fondly my dad coming back from business trips, always on Southwest Airlines it feels like, and he'd have his pockets just filled with these little bags of peanuts, or if I was lucky, the honey roasted peanuts, and that was wonderful. Now, the early 80s saw the golden age of air travel, especially in economy class, come to an end. Many business and first-class flights still go to great lengths to offer quality food, often getting top chefs to prepare menus for the airline. But for me, I don't really mind. I'd rather pay less and get, a stupidly expensive sandwich at the airport and just bring it on with me. The one food you should never bring on an airplane is French fries. I never do that. It just smells up the whole cabin. Don't do that. Though, you could bring on this pot roast because it is also smelling up the cabin, my house, but it smells really, really good. So as soon as the pot roast is cooked through, take it out and simmer down the liquid to about half and then strain it out and save the onions and other vegetables back to serve with the roast itself. And now to prepare a very quick dessert or salad, because even though this is absolutely a dessert, it's actually in the salad section of the book. You'll need 4 tart apples cut into small pieces, then add 32 mini marshmallows and cut 8 maraschino cherries in quarters and mix those all together with the marshmallows and the apples. I'm also making a half portion because this is still going to make a lot of Heavenly Delight salad. In a separate bowl, whip a cup of heavy cream into whipped cream and then add a teaspoon of lemon juice, a teaspoon and a half of mayonnaise, and a teaspoon and a half of honey. Mix it all together, then mix it with the apples, and it's ready to go. And here we are, a full meal worthy of a United Airlines flight from the golden age of air travel. I just have to show you this tray. I put the cups over there, but how cool is this? It's actually not from the 50s, it's from the, I believe the early 60s. I think they said it was about 1963 or 4. But I just thought it was so cool. It's an actual tray from the time. It even has like little salt and peppers. And of course, plasticware. So I'm gonna try to eat a pot roast with this. Let's give it a try. All right, even after like 60 years, the knife is pretty good. Let's go. I knew it would be amazing because it smelled so good. It is so tender, it just falls apart. I really, really like the addition of kind of adding in the onions and the other things that we're cooking on top of it. Unless you get like a bay leaf, don't eat a whole bay leaf, but it's so flavorful, and I will be eating the whole thing over the next couple days. Now let's try the potatoes. So I think that I made a mistake and maybe didn't chop them as fine as I should have. I mean, the flavor's great. It's cream and potatoes and Parmesan cheese. What's not to like? I just think that if I had diced them a little finer, the texture would be a little bit better, or at least they'd be a bit better coated with the cream mixture. Honestly, even doing these as mashed potatoes, I think that's how I'd prefer them. And finally, on to our salad dessert. And get a little bit of everything, a little apple, little cherry. It's not as sweet as I expected. Now, the original recipe says you could actually add sugar. I wouldn't. These are tart apples, but it's not tart. It has a little zing from the apples and from the lemon juice, but it's plenty sweet. It doesn't need to be any sweeter because, I mean, there's plenty of sweet stuff in there. But it reminds me of ambrosia, kind of. If you've ever had ambrosia, my Nana would once in a while make that for Easter. It's fun. It's delicious. I wouldn't call it a salad. It is definitely a dessert, but you know. So I gotta say, all 3 dishes, really good. I would make all 3 again. I'd probably mash the potatoes, but that's the only change I would make. That pot roast is definitely going on in my repertoire of weekly or probably monthly dishes to make. And I will see you next time on Tasting History.